If you then take a look, as we are in this next slide, at where the population shift is in the county, you can go all the way back to the 1920s very quickly in the U.S. Census Bureau data. And you show that in those days, the county population outside the municipalities was essentially equal to the population inside the municipalities. And then as you go to the right on that graph towards the present, those lines get farther apart. The line on the top is the county. The line on the bottom is the city of Asheville. And what that indicates generally is that the population growth has been in the county. One thing that's not represented here, is industrial groundwater users. They are not represented in a population graph, but there are lots of the industrial properties around the county, the plants, use groundwater as well. So I think this is a conservative view of this topic. You could put a sharper edge on it with greater study. This graphic comes from U.S. Geological Survey papers. If you look at the schematic on the left, that big disk at the top represents where groundwater storage primarily occurs. When I go home tonight and turn on my water tap and draw water from a well, it's rainwater, basically, that has been stored near the surface in what most of us think of as dirt. Geologists have another name for it. They call it the regolith, and that's that disk at the top. It's been stored there until the fractures beneath it, which is represented by those straight lines, call on that water. When they're emptied, the water comes out of the sponge, so to speak, at the top and recharges those fractures. Well, most of us think that when our wells go dry, we simply drill another one, or we take our existing well and we make it deeper. You can't do that. The mountains don't work that way. The middle picture is a more detailed graphic that the U.S. Geological Survey uses, and it shows where these fractures occur. Your well has to hit a fracture to get water. If it doesn't, you got a dry well. Or if you hit a fracture without water, you've got a dry well. And what that picture shows is that in the first couple of 100 feet beneath the ground surface, there are lots of fractures. They're in connection with the streams and the rivers and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of water there. And that's where we've been drawing for 100 years in this county. But where we're beginning to draw more and more, as there's a greater demand for this water, is deeper, where there are fewer fractures and where there's less water. And finally, on the right-hand side of that page, there's a graphic that suggests the amount of storage as you get deeper. And as you can see, the deeper you get, the less storage there is. So that once you get to about 600 feet below the surface of the ground, there are no fractures, or very few fractures, and there's virtually no water. So this is not a problem that can be solved simply by adding a well or going deeper. I've got a couple of slides here which simply quote from U.S. Geological Survey papers. One in 1998 was reporting on a study that occurred down in the Piedmont in Guilford County. And you have to recall that this conclusion we'll look at here in a moment is based on a hydrogeologic area that's quite different from the mountains. It's more forgiving in a way, because if you think of that sponge, as I called it a little while ago, at the surface where the water is stored, that sponge is a lot thicker down in the Piedmont than it is up here on the slopes. So there's a lot more water stored there. Well, in 1998, the U.S. Geological Survey said, if you look at the bottom of this highlighted paragraph, that you would need about 2.34 acres per housing unit to sustain the well for that house. Essentially, they're saying that's a minimum lot size in certain areas in Guilford County. This is a U.S. Geological Survey. If you look at the next page, the survey went 4 years later and conducted another study in which they put a little more flesh on the bones of that previous statement. And in the highlighted paragraph, it makes a simple statement that increased groundwater pumpage has caused declines in water levels in places, decreases in well yields, and interference between cones of depression associated with closely spaced pumping wells. A cone of depression is the geologist's phrase to describe what the water table looks like when you've been pumping out of it. You put a straw in a glass, and if you suck on it hard enough, you'll get a cone of depression, and that's all they mean. And their contention here is that where you have closely spaced wells, those cones begin to overlap, and people's wells go dry. So these